He was 19 years old when he died. He ruled for about 10 years, and he was a child for most of them. He won no wars that anyone remembers. He built no great temple that still stands with his name on it. He conquered nothing. He was not loved by the men who came after him. And when he was gone, they went to work with hammers and chisels and cut his name out of the stone, one wall at a time, until there was almost nothing left to say he had ever been alive at all. They very nearly succeeded. For more than 3,000 years he was gone. His name was not in the king lists. It had been quietly left out. He had been erased so thoroughly that the scholars who began to piece that ancient world back together did not know he existed. And here is the thing that turns the whole story upside down. And I want you to hold on to it all the way through tonight, because everything depends on it. The erasing is why we have him. If they had honored him, if they had put his name in the lists and left his monuments alone and remembered him as a proper king, then his tomb would have been known and marked and visited, and it would have been robbed like every other tomb in that valley, stripped to the walls within a few generations. And he would be a name on a broken statue like all the rest. But they hated him, so they forgot him. And because they forgot him, nobody remembered where he was. And 100 years or so after he was buried, workmen cutting a much bigger tomb for a much greater king, a few yards away, dumped their rubble over the little forgotten doorway of the boy who was not supposed to be remembered, and buried it under tons of stone chips and never knew. Their contempt saved him. They put him in the ground and threw dirt on his memory, and the dirt is the only reason he is here. And today he is the most famous Egyptian who has ever lived, more famous than the queen who seduced Rome, more famous than the king who built the Great Pyramid. His face is on posters in bedrooms in countries he could not have imagined, in languages that did not exist while he was breathing. Millions of people who could not name a single other pharaoh can name him. That is the strangest thing about this story, and it is worth sitting with before we begin. The one they tried hardest to forget is the only one nobody can. Tonight we are going to tell it properly, all of it. Where he came from, what happened to him, why they hated him, and what was waiting in the dark behind that sealed door. But before we start, if these quiet journeys into the ancient world bring you a little peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would like to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, where in the world are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below, and then let your shoulders drop and let your breathing slow, and come with me back 3,300 years to a country in the middle of losing its mind. Because to understand the boy, you have to understand his father. And his father may have been the strangest man who ever sat on a throne. Now, to see what he did, you first have to see what he did it to. Egypt, when this story opens, was at the very peak of its power. Not rising, not struggling. At the top, it was the richest and most secure kingdom on earth, an empire stretching from deep in Africa up into the lands of the north, taking tribute from everybody, feared by everybody, at peace, fat, gold-plated, and utterly certain of itself. And it was old. That is the part people always miss. This was already an ancient civilization. The pyramids at that point were more than 1,000 years old. They were tourist attractions. People went to look at them and scratched graffiti on them and marveled that anyone had ever built such things, exactly as we do. Egypt had been doing the same thing, in the same way, worshipping the same gods, in the same temples, for longer than the entire history of the modern world. And at the center of it all stood the great temple of the greatest god, and the priesthood of that god had become something close to a second kingdom. They owned enormous land. They owned herds and ships and towns. They employed tens of thousands. They had wealth that rivaled the crown, and more dangerously, they had a hold on the crown because it was their god who confirmed the king in his power every year in public. The king ruled, but the priests validated, and then into that world came a young man who looked at all of it, all 3,000 years of it, and decided it was wrong. His father had been a great king, magnificent and vain and enormously successful, who built on a scale nobody had built on before, and who lived in luxury that was talked about for centuries. And when that king died, the throne went to his son. And the son was strange from the start. He came to the throne with a normal name, a good name, a name that honored the great God. And for the first few years he behaved. He built. He ruled. He did what kings did, and then he began to change. He began to build for a different god, not one of the old ones, not one of the great crowd of gods with the heads of animals who had filled the temples for 3 millennia. He built for the sun disk itself, not the sun god as they had always known him, with his hawk head and his human form and his stories. The disk, the physical, visible thing in the sky, the light, nothing more. And the way he had it carved was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Not a figure, not a face, just a circle with long rays coming down from it, and at the end of every ray, a small human hand reaching down toward the earth, offering life. A god with no body and no story and no statue. A god who could not be put in a dark room at the back of a temple. A god that everybody, everywhere could see at the same time, simply by looking up. And then he took it further. He changed his own name, cutting the old god out of it and putting the new one in. He declared that this disk was not merely the greatest god. He declared it was the only one. And then he shut the temples. This is the part that is hard to convey because there is no comparison in our world that fits. Imagine every church, every temple, every mosque, every holy building in a country closed by order. Imagine the priests turned out, the estates seized, the incense stopped, the doors barred. Imagine the festivals cancelled, all of them, the great processions that people had lived for and organized their years around, simply not happening. The whole religious life of a nation, 3,000 years deep, switched off. And then he sent men out with chisels. They went into the temples and the tombs and up onto the monuments, and they cut out the name of the old chief god wherever they found it, and the word for gods in the plural, because there were not to be any gods in the plural anymore. They climbed scaffolding to reach the high places. They went into sealed tombs to get at the walls. They chipped the name out of the tops of obelisks 100 feet in the air. You can still see it. Go and look at those walls today, and you will find, over and over, a clean rectangular gouge in the middle of a line of writing, where a name used to be. And then, having done all that, he did the thing that tells you he was truly serious. He left. He decided that the old capital was tainted, that all of it was contaminated by the old gods, and that his new god needed a place that had never belonged to anyone else. So he sailed down the river until he found a bare, empty plain on the east bank, ringed by cliffs, where nobody lived and nothing had ever been built. And he stopped there and he declared that this was the place, and that the god himself had chosen it. And he built a city from nothing, on empty ground, in the middle of the desert. They put up a whole capital in a handful of years, palaces, temples, offices, villas for the great men with gardens and pools, rows and rows of small houses for the workers, bakeries, breweries, workshops, a police force, a garrison, streets, wells, a road for the king to drive his chariot down every morning from the palace to the temple, in state, in the sun, with his wife beside him and the crowds cheering. Tens of thousands of people moved out into a desert plain, into a brand new city, to serve a brand new god. And the temples he built there had no roofs. Think about what that means, after everything we know about how Egyptian temples worked. For 3,000 years, the whole design of a temple had been about darkness. Deeper and deeper, smaller and smaller, until you reached the sealed black room at the back where the god lived in a box. He built the opposite. Open courts, no roof, no sanctuary, no darkroom, no statue in a box. Because his god was up there, and the whole point was to stand in the open with the light falling directly on you. He turned the temple inside out. And he did something else, and this one you can see with your own eyes, and it is the strangest of all. He changed how people looked. For 3,000 years, Egyptian art had followed rules, hard rules. A king was shown young, athletic, perfect, standing straight with broad shoulders and a narrow waist, and a face of serene, idealized calm. Always. Every king. A fat, aging, ailing ruler would be carved as a beautiful athlete of 25. Because that was not a portrait, it was a statement about what a king was. The rules had not changed since the pyramids, and this man threw them out. Look at how he had himself carved. The face is long and narrow, with a heavy jaw that juts, and thick, drooping lips and slanted eyes and hollow cheeks. The neck is thin and long, the chest is narrow, and below it, The belly swells out, and the hips are wide, and the thighs are heavy and rounded, and the arms are thin, and the whole body is soft and strange, and unlike any human being who had ever been shown on an Egyptian wall. Some of the statues go further. There is one where he appears to have no clear sex at all, neither male nor female, or perhaps both. For a long time, people assumed he must have had a disease, and there were a dozen theories, each one naming a condition that could produce that shape. But then they looked at the rest of the family, and his wife is carved the same way, and his daughters are carved the same way, and his courtiers are carved the same way. Everybody in that city is suddenly long-faced and soft-bellied and heavy-hipped. They cannot all have had the same illness, so it was a style. It was a choice, and whatever it meant, it came from the top, because nothing like it appears before him, and nothing like it survives after him. Perhaps he was showing himself as the image of his God, who was neither man nor woman, but the source of all life, and so carried both in one body. Or perhaps he simply looked odd, and instead of hiding it in the old way, he ordered them to show it. And the scenes changed too, and this is the part that gets under my skin. For 3,000 years, kings were shown smiting enemies, hunting lions, making offerings, standing in stiff formal poses beside gods. And in his city, on the walls, you get this instead. The king sitting in a chair, holding one of his small daughters, kissing her. The queen sitting on his lap. A child leaning on her mother's shoulder, reaching up to touch her chin. The family eating dinner. Actually eating, food in their hands, at a table. The two of them standing together with their arms around each other, under the disc, with the little hands of light coming down and touching them. And in one of the most devastating carvings to survive from the ancient world, the king and queen bent over in grief, holding each other, mourning one of their daughters who had died. That had never been done. Not once, in 3,000 years, royalty did not grieve on a wall. Royalty did not slouch, or kiss, or hold a child on a knee. Whatever else he was, this man wanted the world to see him as a human being with a family who loved each other, and he broke the rules of an entire civilization to show it. And in the middle of that city, in that hard, bright light, a boy was born. But let us stand in that city for a moment first, because it is one of the few places in the ancient world we can actually walk through, and it is worth it. Rest here. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. It is early morning on the plain. The cliffs behind the city are catching the first light and going pink and gold, and the great open temple is already filling up because there is no roof, and the worship begins when the sun does. The road runs straight through the middle of everything, wide and beaten smooth, and along it, in a while, the king will come at speed in a gilded chariot with the queen beside him, and the horses in plumes, and the whole city will turn out to watch, because that was the daily theatre of the place, and everybody knew the hour. Behind the main streets are the villas of the great men, and they are lovely. Walled gardens with pools in them, and trees planted for shade, and rooms painted with birds and reeds and pools full of fish, and grain silos in the yard, and stables, and a shrine in the garden where you were expected to worship the king worshipping the god, because that was the arrangement, and the king was the middleman. And further out, past all that, is the workers' village, and it is another world. Small houses in tight rows behind a wall, out on the sand, away from the water. The people who lived there built the tombs and cut the stone and mixed the plaster. Their bones have been dug up and studied, and the study is grim. They were worked very hard. The skeletons show broken bones, spines damaged by loads far too heavy, joints ruined early. A great many of them died young. Many were children and teenagers, and their bones show that they were malnourished and stunted, and had been doing heavy labor from an age when they should have been playing. The City of the Light was built by people who did not get enough to eat. That is worth holding alongside the beautiful hymn. Both are true. They were true at the same time, in the same place, about a mile apart. And in the middle of it, in that hard, bright light, a boy was born. Now, whose boy exactly is one of the great arguments of this whole subject, and I'm going to give it to you straight, because the honest answer is more interesting than a confident one. We think the father was the heretic king. The scientific work on the royal bodies points that way, and most people who study this accept it. The mother is the hard part. It was not, we think, the famous queen, the beautiful one. The one whose painted head is one of the most reproduced images of a human face in the history of the world. She was the king's great wife, and she had 6 daughters with him, and she is everywhere in that city, carved on every wall, driving her own chariot, striking down enemies, worshipping beside her husband as an equal, which no queen had ever done before. But no son. The boy seems to have come from another woman, a secondary wife, and here is where it gets uncomfortable, so let me simply tell you what the bones say. The bones say that the boy's mother and the boy's father were brother and sister. That is what the science indicates. The mother has been identified as best anyone can as a woman buried in a side chamber of a tomb, and the family analysis points to full siblings. The royal family of that country married within itself, and had done so for a very long time, because a king was a god, and a god should marry a god. And there was no one of sufficient rank to marry except your own family. It made a kind of religious sense to them. It also breaks bodies, and it broke his. Because the boy who was born in that new city, in the light of that new God, was not well, and he would not be well for a single day of the 19 years he was given. We will come to what was wrong with him. It is a long list, and I'm not going to dress it up for you, and I am also not going to make him pitiful, because he was not. For now hold this. He was a small boy in a brand new city, in a country that had been turned upside down, the son of a father who had made himself hated by every priest and half the nobility in the kingdom, and he was quite probably the only son, the only heir. The one thing standing between this whole extraordinary experiment and the end of the line. And his name, when he was born, was not the name you know. He was born with the name of the sun disk in it. He was named for his father's god. The heresy was built into his name from the first day of his life. Now, we know very little about his childhood, and that is a hard thing to accept when you are talking about the most famous person of the ancient world. But it is the truth. He does not appear much. He is a small figure in the background of a few scenes. There is a mention here and there. He was raised, we think, in the palaces of the new city, and among the things found in his tomb are the things of a childhood, and they are the saddest and most human objects in the whole collection. There is a small chair, a child's chair made for a boy of about 5 or 6 in wood and ebony and ivory, worn smooth in places. There are toys, board games, several of them, some of them beautiful and elaborate and some of them plain and battered. There is a lock of hair, not his. It belonged to his grandmother, and it was kept in a nest of small coffins, one inside another, and buried with him. Somebody, in the middle of arranging the burial of a king, made sure that a lock of an old woman's hair went into the tomb with the boy, because it had mattered to him. There are clothes in a range of sizes, from small to grown, as if a wardrobe had simply been packed up and sent along. There are walking sticks, dozens of them, more than 130 of them actually, and we will come back to those, because they are not what you think. And there are gloves, little ones. Now the trouble was coming, and it was coming from every direction at once. But before it comes, I want to give the father one thing, because I have been hard on him, and he deserves this much. He wrote a hymn, or it was written for him, or in his name, and it was carved on the walls of the tombs of his courtiers in that new city, and it is one of the most beautiful things that survives from the ancient world. It is a hymn to the sun, and it is not about power, and it is not about war, and it is not about the king. It is about the morning. It speaks of the dawn breaking over the horizon, and of the whole earth waking up because of it. It says that when the sun goes down, the land is in darkness, as if it were dead. Men sleep in their rooms with their heads covered. Thieves come out. Lions come out of their dens. Snakes bite. The world is a black and frightened place, and then the sun rises and the darkness runs away, and the people wake up and wash themselves and put on their clothes and lift up their arms. The cattle are content in their pasture. The trees and the plants grow green. The birds fly up out of their nests and lift their wings in praise. The fish in the river leap up toward the light. The ships go north and the ships go south, and every road is open because the sun has appeared. It speaks of the chick inside the egg, still in the shell, already breathing, because the god gave it breath in there in the dark. And it says the chick comes out of the egg at the right moment and walks on its own legs from the moment it breaks the shell. And it says that this god made the great river for the people of Egypt, and made a river in the sky for the foreign lands, so that rain would fall on them and their fields would grow too. Think about that for a second. A God who takes care of the foreigners as well, in an empire built on tribute and conquest. Somebody in that city, 3,300 years ago, wrote a line saying that the light falls on everyone, and that even the people we conquer were given a river of their own up in the sky. Whatever else he broke, he wrote that. Or he had it written, and his son grew up hearing it. Now the trouble. Because while the king was in his new city, standing in the sunlight with his arms raised, worshipping his disk, the empire was falling apart. The letters survive. This is one of the extraordinary strokes of luck in all of archaeology. A whole archive of diplomatic correspondence, hundreds of clay tablets, was found in the ruins of that city, and on them is the foreign policy of the empire, written in the international language of the day, and it is a record of a slow catastrophe. They are letters from the vassal kings of the north, the client rulers of the cities Egypt controlled, and they are begging. They write that the enemy is coming. They write that the neighboring cities have fallen. They write that they are loyal, that they have always been loyal, that they have paid their tribute, and that if the king would only send troops, a small force, even a handful of men, they could hold. They write again. They write that the enemy is at the gates. They write that no one has answered. They write that the city has fallen. One of them in the middle of it writes something that goes straight through you across 3,000 years. He asks, in effect, why does my Lord not answer me? Am I not his servant? Does he not care? And the answer, apparently, was that the king was busy. He was in his new city, in the desert, composing hymns to the sun. It is possible that this is unfair. It is possible he was doing more than we can see, and that the empire's troubles were larger than one man. Historians argue about it, and they will go on arguing. But the letters are there, and the cities were lost. And the empire that his father had held without effort began under him to come apart at the edges. And at home it was worse, because he had done something no king should ever do. He had taken away the people's gods. Understand what that meant to an ordinary person. Not the theology, the life. The festivals were gone. Those were the days when the god came out of his temple and the whole valley stopped work, and there was music and free bread and beer for a fortnight. Gone. The local gods were gone. The little household gods, the ones people actually prayed to, the ones who protected a woman in childbirth and kept snakes out of the house and looked after your children, officially gone. And the afterlife was gone. That is the one that must have been unbearable. 3,000 years of careful preparation, of the journey through the night, of the weighing of the heart, of the field of reeds where you would see your family again, all of it swept away and replaced with something vague and thin and new, in which everything came from the king, and the king was the only one who knew the God. He took away their dead, and the archaeology tells us they did not accept it. In the workers' houses in his own city, his brand new city built to serve his one God, they have dug up the little household shrines of the old gods hidden away, kept quietly in the homes of the very people who were building his temples. They went to work in the morning and carved the sun disk for the king, and they came home in the evening and prayed to the god with the head of a dwarf who kept their children safe. Nobody was fooled. Nobody had changed. They were waiting. And then he died. But before he does, we have to talk about her because she vanishes and nobody knows why, and it is one of the great open wounds of this whole story. The queen, the famous one, the one with the painted head, you have seen it. A woman's head and neck and shoulders in painted limestone, with a tall, flat-topped blue crown, and a long neck, and a face of such calm and balanced beauty that it has become, for a great many people, the single image that the word Egypt calls to mind. It was found in the ruins of a sculptor's workshop in that abandoned city, sitting on a shelf, left behind when everyone walked away. It is unfinished. One eye was never inlaid. There is only an empty socket where it should be, and it has been staring out of that hole for 3,300 years. And she was not decoration. She was not a consort in the background. She is everywhere on the walls of that city, and she is doing things no queen had ever been shown doing. She drives her own chariot. She makes offerings to the god directly. Without her husband standing between her and the divine, which was not how it worked, she is shown at the same size as the king, which in Egyptian art is a statement about rank and is never accidental. And on at least one carving, she is shown in the classic pose of a pharaoh, gripping a kneeling enemy by the hair with a weapon raised, about to strike. A queen, smiting a captive. That is the image of kingship itself, and she is in it. She had extraordinary power. That is not a guess, it is on the walls, and then, somewhere in the last years of the reign, she disappears from the record, and nobody knows what happened to her. She may have died. That is the simple answer, and it may well be the right one. Or she may have done something far more interesting. Because there is a shadowy figure who appears at the very end, a co-ruler with a new name, someone sitting beside the king or ruling after him, and there is a strong case argued fiercely by serious people that this figure is her, that she put on the crown herself, that she ruled Egypt as a king under a new name at the end of the heresy, and that it was she who began steering the country back from the cliff. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it was someone else. Perhaps it was a shadowy elder brother nobody can identify. The evidence is thin and everyone reads it differently, and there is no agreement and there may never be. But she is one of the most famous faces on this earth, and we do not know how she died, or where she is buried, or whether she ruled, and her tomb has never been found. And she was, we think, the boy's stepmother, and she raised him, perhaps, and her daughter would become his wife. Now he died. We do not know how. He simply stops, after about 17 years on the throne, and after him there is a stretch of confusion so tangled that the people who study it professionally still cannot fully agree on what happened. There is at least one short reign in between, possibly two, possibly by a woman, possibly by the famous queen herself under a different name, possibly by someone else entirely. The evidence is thin and contradictory, and everyone has a theory, and nobody has proof. What we can say is this: within a very few years the great experiment was leaderless, and the country was exhausted, and the priesthoods were waiting in the wings with their hands out, and the empire was shrinking, and the treasury was strained, and there was nobody left with the will or the standing to keep the thing going. And the throne came to a child. He was, we think, about 9 years old. 9. Picture him. A small boy, sickly, with a foot that does not work properly, standing in a room full of grown men in a palace, in a city built for a god that half the country hates, while somebody puts the crown of the two lands on his head. Around him, the men who would actually be running things. A soldier, hard and capable, who commanded the army and who had risen through nothing but competence, and who was probably the most powerful man in Egypt. And an old courtier, a survivor, who had served the boy's father, and had somehow come through the whole heresy with his position intact, which tells you exactly what kind of man he was. Look at those two for a moment, because they matter enormously, and they are going to be standing over this boy for the whole of his life. The old one had been there from the beginning. He had been a great man in the heretics' court, in the new city, and his tomb was cut there, and on the wall of it is carved that beautiful hymn to the sun. He had been all the way in, and then when the wind changed, he was all the way out, and back at the old capital, restoring the old gods, without missing a step. Men like that do not survive 20 years of revolution and counter-revolution by accident. He was, by any measure, extremely good at this. And the soldier was the other kind of dangerous. He had no royal blood at all. He came from nowhere. And he had made himself indispensable. And he had the army, and everybody knew it. And he was young enough to wait. 2 men, one who knew where every body was buried, and one who commanded the men who could bury more. And between them, a 9-year-old with a bad foot. Both of them would end up wearing the crown. The old courtier first, briefly, and then the soldier, who would rule for a long time, and who would set about scrubbing the heresy, and everyone connected to it out of the record, with a thoroughness that is chilling to look at, including the boy. But that is later. For now there is a 9-year-old boy on a golden chair, and the country is broken and something has to be done, and within a very short time something is. The city in the desert is abandoned, just like that. The greatest urban project in 1,000 years, the capital of the empire, a city of tens of thousands built from nothing in a decade, is simply left. The court goes back north. The government moves out. The workers follow, because there is no work. The bakeries stop. The wells silt up. The palaces stand empty, and then the mud brick begins to slump, and the sand starts to come in through the doors. And within a few generations, there is nothing out there on that plain but rubble and a few walls and the wind. They walked away and never came back, and that is why so much of it survived for us to find, because nobody ever built on top of it. It just lay there in the desert, undisturbed, holding all its letters and its rubbish and its little hidden shrines, waiting 3,000 years for somebody to come and read them. And the boy king changed his name. The name he had been given at birth, the one with the sun disk in it, was set aside, and in its place he took a new one, with the name of the old god in it, the great god, the one his father had tried to destroy. The boy who had been named for the heresy was renamed for the restoration. He was 9, he did not choose that. Somebody chose it for him. And then they carved a great stone slab and set it up in the old temple, and on it they put a declaration in his name. And it is one of the most remarkable documents to come out of that world, because it is essentially an apology for his own father. It says, in the voice of a child, that the land had been in chaos, that the temples had fallen into ruin, that their courts were overgrown with weeds as if they had never been, that the gods had turned their backs on this country, that if you prayed to a god, he would not come, that if you begged a goddess, she would not answer. The world, it says, was in confusion, and the gods had abandoned it, and now it says, I have made it right, I have rebuilt the temples, I have restored the shrines, I have made new statues of the gods out of gold, out of the best of everything. I have appointed new priests from the good families. I have given back the land and the herds and the offerings and doubled them and tripled them. The gods are happy again, it says. The land is happy again. Everything is as it was before. That is the reign in a sentence. His whole job from the age of 9 was to undo his father, to be the boy who apologized, to be the one who reopened the temples his father had barred, and paid back the priests his father had robbed, and put back the gods his father had erased, and gave a broken and frightened country its funerals back. And he did it. Whoever was actually holding the pen, whoever was actually making the decisions, it was done in his name, and it worked. The temples opened, the festivals came back, the old gods came home. The nightmare was over, and the country breathed out. And it was not cheap talk. The restoration was enormous, and it was expensive, and it went on for years. The temples had been shut for the best part of 2 decades. The roofs had gone. The doors had been carried off. Weeds and sand had come into the courts. The statues had been smashed or taken away or defaced, and the priesthoods had been dissolved and their people scattered into other work, and the estates that fed them had been seized. All of that had to be undone, by hand. New statues had to be carved, in gold and in precious stone, for gods whose images had been destroyed. New priests had to be appointed and trained, and they were taken from the good families, the sons of the men who had lost everything, which was a shrewd political move by whoever thought of it. The land had to be given back, the herds had to be restocked, the daily offerings had to be funded again, and the endowment doubled and tripled to make up for the years of nothing. The great processional festivals, which had not been held in a generation, were revived. And that meant a whole generation of Egyptians saw the god come out of his temple for the first time in their lives, carried on the shoulders of the priests out into the light, with the drums and the crowds and the free bread. They had grown up hearing their parents talk about it, and now it was happening in front of them. Imagine being in that crowd. Imagine what that felt like. Whoever gets the credit, that was done in the name of a boy who was not yet a teenager. He was the one who fixed it, and they hated him anyway, because he was his father's son, and that was enough. And when he was dead, and there was nobody left to protect his memory, the men who came after would put him on the list of the damned, the enemy, the abomination, and they would cut his name out of the stone along with his father's, and leave him out of the king lists, and pull down his statues and carve their own names on them, and do their best to make it as though he had never been born. That is what he was up against. That is who he was. A sick boy, on a throne he did not ask for, in a ruined country, cleaning up a mess that was not his, and hated for a heresy he was too young to have chosen. And he had about 10 years to live. We are going to spend them with him. We are going to find out what was actually wrong with his body, and what those 130 walking sticks were really for, and why that answer is not the sad one everybody assumes. We are going to meet the girl he married, who was his half-sister, and who was probably the only person alive who understood exactly what his childhood had been, because she had lived it beside him. We are going to look at the 2 tiny coffins that were found in his tomb, and at what was inside them, and it is the saddest thing in the whole of Egyptian archaeology, and it explains everything about why the line ended. We are going to work out how he died, as far as anyone can, and take apart the murder theories one by one and see which ones survive. And we are going to watch what happened in the days after his death, when a 19-year-old king died with no heir and no plan, and a tomb that was not ready, and the men around him had to improvise very fast, in a great hurry, in a way that left fingerprints all over the burial that we can still read today. But not tonight. Not yet. For now, let him be a boy, 9 years old, in a palace, in a country that is slowly turning right side up again. There is a small chair with his name on it, and a board game, and a lock of his grandmother's hair kept safe in a little box. The gods are coming home. The temples are opening. Somewhere out in the desert, a city is being left to the sand, and nobody, anywhere in the world, has any idea that 3,300 years from now, his will be the only face out of all of them that everyone alive still knows. Let us start with the body, because everything else follows from it. For most of the last 100 years, the boy king was a picture in people's heads rather than a person. A golden mask, a romantic idea, a tragic young prince, beautiful and doomed, who died mysteriously and was probably murdered, and about whom you could say more or less anything you liked because nobody actually knew. And then they put him in a machine. They took the body out of the tomb very carefully, and they ran it through a scanner, thousands of images slice by slice all the way through, and they built him again inside a computer, and they took samples from him and from 10 other royal bodies, and they read the genetic material in them, and they compared it, and they built the family tree. And the boy stopped being a picture and became a patient. And I want to be honest with you about the science, because it is not as settled as the headlines made it sound. Ancient genetic material is fragile. It degrades. In hot climates, it degrades faster. And a body that has been handled, unwrapped, examined, moved and touched by a great many people over the last century is a body that is full of other people's traces. There are serious researchers who look at those results and raise their eyebrows and say that the samples may be contaminated and that some of the conclusions have been stated with more confidence than the evidence can carry. So hold it lightly. The family tree is probably right, and most people accept it. The illnesses are on firmer ground because you can see a bent foot on a scan, and a scan does not care what anybody wants to be true. Here is what they found, and I am going to give it to you plainly. And I am not going to make him pathetic because he was not. He had a club foot. The left one, it was turned inward, and the bones of it were malformed, and one of the toes was missing a bone entirely, and the bone in that foot was dying. There is a condition where the blood supply to part of the bone fails, and the bone tissue begins to break down, and he had it, and it would have been painful. Not occasionally, continuously. He had a cleft palate, a small one, unrepaired. His spine had a mild curve to it, and he had malaria. Not once. The genetic traces of the parasite are in his tissue, and they suggest more than one infection of the most dangerous kind there is. And his parents were brother and sister, and his grandparents on one side were probably first cousins, and the family had been marrying inward for generations. And everything I have just listed is exactly the kind of thing that happens when a bloodline folds in on itself over and over again. So put him together in your mind. A young man, not tall, slightly built, walking with a limp, on a foot that hurt him with every step, whose immune system had been through malaria more than once, who had probably been ill for large parts of his short life. And then look at what was in his tomb. There were more than 130 walking sticks in there. 130. For a long time people said, well, A staff is a symbol of authority. Kings carried them. It means nothing. And that is partly true. Some of them are ceremonial, jeweled, gorgeous, clearly made to be held and not leaned on, but not all of them. Some of them are plain. Some of them are worn. Some of them show the polish and the wear of a stick that has been used hard over years by somebody's hand and somebody's weight. He was not collecting them. He was using them. And he is shown, in his own tomb and on his own furniture, sitting down, on a throne, on a stool, leaning on a stick. In one scene he is seated while hunting birds, which is not a normal way to hunt birds, and he is shown holding a staff even in scenes where a healthy king would be standing. He needed them, and he did not hide it, and it went into the tomb with him, now. Here is where I want to push back on the picture, because the story usually goes straight from that list of ailments to a frail invalid prince tucked up in a palace, and I do not think that is right, and the tomb does not support it, because they also buried him with 6 chariots, and bows, dozens of them, and arrows by the 100, and throwing sticks and slings and shields and body armor made of leather scales and daggers and swords and a whip. And the walls of his tomb and the objects in it show him hunting, shooting, riding, trampling enemies. A painted box in there shows him in a chariot alone, reins tied around his waist so both hands are free, driving into the enemy with a bow drawn. Some of that is propaganda. Of course it is. Every king was shown crushing his enemies, and half of them never went near a battle. But the equipment is real. The chariots are real, and they are not toys, and some of them show wear. The armor is real. The bows are worn. And there is a thing about those chariots that I find quietly moving. Some of the ones in his tomb are built light and stripped down and open, and the axle is set in a way that makes them stable rather than fast. There has been an argument, a serious one, that some of them were adapted, modified, made easier for a man who could not stand comfortably on a normal racing chariot to ride in, which would mean somebody sat down and thought about how to get a boy with a ruined foot out of the palace and into the desert with a bow in his hand, and then built him a machine that would let him do it. That is not the story of an invalid in a bed. That is the story of a kid with a bad leg who went anyway. I like him for that. I like whoever built those chariots for him even more. Now, the reign. He came to the throne at about 9 and he lived about 10 years more, and the record of what happened in those years is thin, and much of it was taken away on purpose. But the shape is clear enough. The capital moved back. The temples reopened. The gods came home. The restoration we talked about last time was carried out in his name and paid for out of the treasury, and it was expensive and it was thorough and it worked. He, or the men behind him, spent a great deal of money making peace with the priesthoods that his father had ruined. He built, not enormously, but he built, and he added to the great temples, and he restored what had been smashed. And here is the cruel joke of it. Almost everything he built, everything he restored, everything that carried his name, was later taken by the men who came after him, who simply chiseled his name off and carved their own into the same stone, and took the credit. There are statues of him standing in museums today wearing another man's name. And there was war, or at least there was fighting. His generals campaigned. The empire that had been shrinking under his father was pushed back out a little. The painted box in his tomb shows him in battle against the peoples of the north and the south, and while he may never have swung a weapon in anger, the armies of Egypt moved again under his name, and that mattered. And through all of it he was being watched. Try to imagine what that childhood actually was. You are 9. You are the king of the world, and everybody bows and everybody obeys, and nothing you say can be refused, and nothing you say matters. Because there are 2 men standing behind the chair, and they are the ones who decide. The old one, with the soft voice and the long memory, who was there when your father tore the country apart and who has somehow ended up on the right side of it, and the soldier, who says less and who has the army. And you know, because you are not stupid, and nobody who survives that palace is stupid, that if you were to die tomorrow, neither of them would grieve for very long. So you grow up in a house where the 2 people who run your life are also the 2 people who benefit most from your death. And you have a foot that will not carry you properly, and you are ill more often than not, and your wife is your half-sister, and she has lost 2 babies and there is no heir. And every year without an heir tightens the thing around your throat, because the moment you die without a son, whoever is standing closest gets everything. And they knew that. And he knew that they knew it. 19 years. That is all he got. And a good many of them must have been frightening. And somewhere in those 10 years, he married. But first, let him live a little, because the tomb tells us how and hardly anybody bothers to look. The objects in there are not all gold. A great many of them are simply the contents of a young man's life, packed up and sent with him. And they are the most human things in the whole collection. There are beds, several of them, with woven mattresses and headrests. There is a folding camp bed, a clever thing with hinges, made so it could be taken out into the desert and set up wherever he was. There are chests full of clothes, and somebody has counted them, and there are more than 100 pairs of underwear in that tomb. Loincloths, neatly folded. There are sandals, dozens of pairs, and some of them have the figures of Egypt's enemies painted on the soles, so that with every step he took, he was walking on them. There are gloves and a scarf, and a set of ceremonial robes so covered in gold sequins that it would have rattled and flashed with every movement. There is a razor, there is a paint box, an actual scribe's palette with cakes of colored ink in it, and the ink has been used. Worn down in the middle, the way a paint box gets used by a child who has a favorite color. There are board games, several sets, and one of them is exquisite, with a drawer for the pieces and knuckle bones to throw instead of dice. There is food, baskets and baskets of it, bread, dried meat, dates, chickpeas, honey, spices. There are more than 20 jars of wine, and every one of them is labeled, like a modern bottle, with the vintage, the vineyard, and the name of the chief winemaker. You can read the labels. You can see which years he liked. There are trumpets, 2 of them, one silver and one bronze, and in the last century somebody played them, and the sound was recorded and you can still hear it. A note blown through an instrument that was made for a boy who has been dead for 3,000 years. And there is a small ivory headrest and a lamp, and a fan made of ostrich feathers, and on the handle of the fan there is an inscription saying that the king got these feathers himself, hunting in the desert east of the city. A boy with a bad foot went out into the desert and hunted ostrich, and was proud enough of it to have it written on the fan. That is who he was. Underwear and board games and wine labels and a paint box worn down in the middle. Not a golden mask, a teenager. And somewhere in those 10 years he married. Now she is the person in this story I think about most, and hardly anybody talks about her. She was his half-sister. She was a daughter of the heretic king and of the beautiful queen, the one with the painted head, which means she had grown up in that same strange, bright city, worshipping that same disc, watching that same family fall apart. She had lost sisters. She had probably watched her mother vanish out of the record. She was, in all likelihood, the only living person who had been through exactly what he had been through. They married as children. She may have been a year or 2 older than him, and they were king and queen of Egypt before either of them was old enough to be trusted with anything at all. And there is an image of the 2 of them, and it is on the back of a golden throne that was found in his tomb, and it is one of the most tender things to survive from that entire civilization. He is sitting down, relaxed, slouched a little, with one arm slung over the back of the chair, in a pose no pharaoh had ever been carved in before the heresy, and none would be carved in again after it. And she is standing in front of him, leaning in, and she is reaching out with one hand, and she is touching his shoulder, anointing him with perfumed oil, and she is looking at him, and he is looking at her. That is it. That is the whole scene. 2 teenagers, alone, in the sunlight, one of them touching the other's shoulder. The most powerful couple in the world, and what they chose to have carved in gold on the back of the throne was a small domestic moment. Whatever their marriage was, and it was arranged, and it was between half-siblings, and it was a political necessity. Somebody wanted that image to exist, and they took it into the grave. And it is not the only one. There is a small golden shrine in that tomb, covered in scenes of the 2 of them, and the scenes are all like this. She is handing him an arrow while he sits and shoots at birds in the marsh. She is crouched at his feet, looking up at him. She is pouring something into his cup. She is tying a collar around his neck. She is holding out flowers to him, and he is bending down to smell them, over and over, on panel after panel in gold. Two young people doing small ordinary things for each other. The art of the heresy did that. It was the one good thing it left behind. For a few decades, in that strange broken chapter, Egyptian artists were allowed to show people touching each other and looking at each other and being tender. And then the door closed again and the old rules came back, and nobody was ever carved like that again. So we have this narrow window, a few decades wide, in 3,000 years of stiff and formal art, and it happens to fall exactly across the life of the one king everybody has heard of. And through that window, we can see a boy and a girl who seem, at the very least, to have been kind to each other. In a story with this much cruelty in it, I will take that. And then there are the two little coffins. In the treasury of the tomb, in a plain wooden box, tucked away, the excavators found two miniature coffins laid side by side, and inside each one was another coffin, and inside that, wrapped in linen, mummified with care, prepared exactly as a person of the highest rank would be prepared, was a baby. Two baby girls, both stillborn or dead at or near birth. One of them was very small, only a few months into a pregnancy that ended. The other was further along, close to term, and she had been given a full burial, wrapped with a gilded mask made for her, sized for a head the size of an apple. The genetic work says they were his daughters, and the mother was, almost certainly, the girl on the golden throne. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole tragedy of the line in one small box. Two teenagers, both of them the products of generations of inbreeding, both of them carrying whatever damage that carries, trying to have a child, and losing one, and trying again, and losing that one too. And then he died, and there were no more. The dynasty that had ruled the greatest empire on earth ends there, in a wooden box, with two baby girls who never drew a breath, buried beside their father who was 19. They put them in the tomb with him because he was going to need them on the other side, because they were his family, and the family went with you, because two children who never lived were still his children. And there was a world coming where he could be their father properly, in the light, beside a river that never runs dry. Somebody made a tiny gold mask for a stillborn baby. I do not think I can add anything to that. So rest here for a moment gently before we go on, not in the sadness, beside it, because there is something in that little box that is not only grief. There is a father who intended to see his daughters again. That is what the burial means. He did not put them in the ground and say goodbye. He took them with him into the boat, into the night, through the gates, all the way to the field of reeds, because he expected to arrive there and to have them in his arms in the sunlight, alive at last, beside a river that never runs dry. That was the whole point of everything they built. Every ton of stone, every day of the 70, every word painted on a coffin lid. They could not accept goodbye, so they made a country on the other side where goodbye did not happen. And whether or not any of it was true, he believed it. And he went into the dark believing that his girls were coming with him. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing to be done about any of this now. It was all decided a very long time ago, and everyone involved has been at peace for 3,000 years. Now, how did he die? For most of a century, the answer was murder, and it was a wonderful story, and it was almost certainly wrong. The murder theory came from a shadow. When they first X-rayed the body back in the middle of the last century, they saw a loose fragment of bone inside the skull and a thin, dark area at the base of the brain. And somebody suggested a blow to the back of the head, and the world ran with it. A young king, an unpopular restoration, a ruthless general, and a scheming old courtier standing right behind him, both of whom would take his throne. It rights itself. The scans killed it. The bone fragment inside the skull is loose, which means it broke off after death and after mummification, because if that damage had happened while he was alive, there would be signs of bleeding and healing around it, and there are none. It was almost certainly done by the embalmers, or by the men who unwrapped him in the 20th century and were rather rough about it. There is no crushed skull. There is no blow to the head. Nobody hit him. So, what did happen? Here is what they found. And here is where the honest answer is a shrug with some strong candidates in it. He had a broken leg, the left thigh bone fractured just above the knee, badly, an open break that went through the skin. And the scans suggest it happened shortly before he died, because there is a hint of the very first stage of healing around it, and because the embalming resin got into the wound, which means the wound was open when they laid hands on him. An open fracture of the thigh, in a world with no antibiotics, in a young man whose immune system had already been through malaria more than once. That will kill you. It killed a great many people for most of human history, and it did not need any help. So the leading picture is something like this. He falls, or he is thrown, or something hits him, the leg breaks open, infection takes hold, and a body already fighting a parasite, already frail, already carrying a footful of dying bone, cannot fight it off, and within a few days or weeks he is gone. How did the leg break? That is where the theories start again. A chariot crash is the popular one, and it fits the equipment in the tomb, and it fits the pattern of the injury. And it makes a good story, and it might well be true. Although a foot like his may have made it hard for him to stand in a chariot at all, which is part of why some people doubt it, a fall from a height, a horse, a hunting accident. There is one theory, and it is strange enough to mention, that he was killed by a hippopotamus, which sounds absurd until you learn that the hippo is one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, that Egyptian kings hunted them, and that his body is missing its heart, which is deeply unusual and suggests his chest was badly damaged. Because that is the other odd thing. His heart is gone, not moved, not in a jar, absent. And after everything we have said about what the heart meant to these people, and how it was the one organ they always left inside the body because it would be needed at the weighing, a king buried without his heart is not a small thing. Something happened to his chest. His ribs on one side are missing too, cut away, and the front of his chest wall is gone. Some of that may be damage from the excavators who were not gentle. Some of it may be looting by robbers who went for the jewelry on the chest, or something crushed him. We do not know. We may never know. Anybody who tells you they are certain is selling something. And there is one more thing about that body, and it is the strangest detail in the entire story, and almost nobody knows it. He burned, not in a fire in the tomb, not from a torch. The body itself, inside the coffin, inside the sealed sarcophagus in the dark, was charred. The flesh is blackened. There is evidence that the tissue was scorched, and the analysis suggests it reached a temperature high enough to carbonize. And the leading explanation is that it happened by accident and slowly and inside the coffin after the lid went on. Because the embalmers used oils and resins, and they used a great deal of them on this burial, and they poured them over the body, and they may have poured them on too thick or used a mixture that was not right. And a certain kind of oil, in the presence of linen, in a warm, sealed space with the right amount of air, will begin to oxidize. And that reaction gives off heat, and the heat speeds up the reaction, and the heat builds, and it can catch, which means that somewhere in the darkness of that sealed tomb, days or weeks or months after everyone had gone home, inside 3 nested coffins under a stone lid weighing more than a ton, in a room that would not be opened for 3,000 years, the body of the king slowly began to smolder and burned quietly, in the dark, with nobody there, and went out eventually when the air ran out and cooled and lay still. They gave him everything. They gave him the gold and the chariots and the food and the little servants and the words on the walls. And the one thing they were supposed to do above all others, the one thing the whole religion turned on, the preservation of the body so that the soul could come home and recognize it, was the one thing that went wrong. The 70 days of care, the salt, the linen, the amulets, the golden face, and he burned anyway, and nobody knew. Not one person ever, until a man opened the coffin and found a blackened thing inside it, and did not understand what he was looking at. Now, what happened next was done in an enormous hurry. What we can say is that a 19-year-old with a broken leg and an infection and malaria died suddenly without an heir, and that everything that followed was improvised. And we can prove the hurry, because the burial is a mess, and the mess is evidence. Start with the tomb. It is small, it is far too small. It is the tomb of a nobleman, not a king. 4 modest rooms, and only one of them decorated, and the rest left as bare rock. Every other king in that valley has a great descending corridor, hall after hall, hundreds of feet into the mountain, every surface covered with the whole journey of the night. He got 4 rooms and a small painted box of a burial chamber, and the treasure was not laid out. It was piled in, chariots taken apart and stacked, boxes shoved into corners, furniture jammed against furniture. When the excavators opened it, they found the greatest treasure ever discovered, thrown into a space that could barely hold it. They packed him into a cupboard, and it looks very much as though this was not his tomb at all. It looks like somebody else's tomb, a private tomb, a smaller person's tomb, hurriedly taken over and pressed into service because the king was dead at 19, and his own tomb was nowhere near finished, and a body has to go in the ground in 70 days. And then there is the paint. The walls of the burial chamber were painted, and the paint had brown spots all over it. Microbial growth. Something living had bloomed on that surface, and then died there when the tomb ran out of air. Which means the paint was still wet when they sealed the door. They painted the room and shut it, and did not wait for it to dry because there was no time. And the objects, many of the finest things in that tomb, were not made for him. His name has been carved over somebody else's. The cartouches have been altered. There are pieces where you can still see the original name underneath, scratched out and replaced. There is a serious argument, and it is not a fringe one, that even the second coffin and possibly parts of the golden mask itself were made for someone else, and that the someone else may have been a woman, and that the woman may have been the one with the painted head. Which would mean that the most famous face in the world, the golden mask, the image on every poster and every book cover, may have been made for somebody else entirely, and handed down to a boy because there was no time to make him one of his own. The argument runs on a few things. The face of the mask and the face of the coffins do not entirely match one another, as if they came from different workshops or different people. There are traces on the mask where a cartouche appears to have been altered. The ears of the mask are pierced, which is a thing done for children and for women, and not usually shown on a grown king. And parts of it look to some eyes like they were made for a smaller and finer face than the one underneath. Others disagree strongly and say the mask is his, and that the piercing means nothing, and that the reuse argument has been pushed too far. I do not know, nobody does. But the reuse elsewhere in the tomb is not in doubt. It is all over the place. Names scratched out and replaced. Objects that clearly began life belonging to someone else. Coffins that fit awkwardly inside one another, as though they were not made as a set. The innermost coffin is so heavy and so tight inside the second that the lid of the outer sarcophagus would not close properly and had to be planned down, and the plain shavings were still lying in the bottom of the box when it was opened. Somebody stood in that room, in a hurry, with a 19-year-old king's body waiting, and had to shave wood off a coffin to make the lid fit. And the outer stone lid itself is the wrong one. It is made of a different stone from the box it sits on, and it is cracked across the middle, and the crack has been plastered over and painted to hide it. They buried a king of Egypt with hand-me-downs in a borrowed tomb under a broken lid, with the paint still wet, because he died before anyone was ready. But before all of that, they had to bury him. And we know better than we know almost any funeral in history exactly how that day went, because they buried the funeral too. In a pit near the tomb, the excavators found the leftovers. Everything used in the burial rites gathered up afterward and put in the ground because it had touched the body of a king and could not simply be thrown away. There were the linens used in the embalming. There were the bags of the salt that had dried him. There were bandages. There were the jars and bowls and rags of the workshop, and there were the remains of a meal, bones of sheep and cattle and duck, wine jars, bread, broken pottery cups and floral collars, the sort of thing you would wear at a feast. Because after the funeral, they ate. There were, by the look of it, about 8 of them, 8 people sitting down at the door of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings at the end of the day. With the dust settling and the sun going down, and a 19-year-old boy sealed in the rock behind them, having the last meal that anyone would ever share with the king of Egypt. And when they had finished, they took the cups and the bones and the collars from around their necks, and they buried them. because it had been a sacred meal and the remains were holy, and they walked back down the hill. Somebody that evening went home and could not sleep. Now, the day itself. He was carried up the valley on a sledge in his coffins, in a shrine, dragged by the great men of the court, and behind him came everything he owned: the chariots, the chairs, the beds, the chests of clothing, the boxes of jewelry, the little wooden servants, his bows, his board games, his grandmother's hair. And the mourners walked and wailed and threw dust over their heads, and the professional mourning women tore their hair, and the whole thing went slowly up the hot valley in the sun. And at the door of the tomb they stood the coffin upright, and a man came forward with the tools and touched them to the mouth of the golden mask, and the eyes, and the ears, and gave the dead boy back his breath and his sight and his voice. And the man who performed that rite was the old courtier. We know because he had himself painted on the wall of the burial chamber doing it, wearing the leopard skin of the priest, and wearing on his head the crown of a king of Egypt. He put himself on the wall of the boy's tomb already crowned, performing the ceremony that a son performs for a father over the body of a 19-year-old who had died without a son. The message could not have been plainer if he had shouted it. "I am the heir. I am the one who buried him. The throne is mine." He painted his claim to the throne on the inside of the boy's grave, in a room he expected nobody would ever see again. And then, in the days after, the widow did something extraordinary. She was, at that moment, perhaps 20 years old. Her husband was dead. Her father was dead. Her mother was gone. Her sisters were gone. Her 2 daughters were dead before they lived. She was the last of her family, the last of a line that went back generations, and she was completely, absolutely alone in a palace full of men who wanted her throne, and whoever married her would be king. So she wrote a letter. It survives. Not the original, but the record of it, kept in the archives of a foreign empire far to the north, the great rival power of that age, and it is one of the most astonishing documents from the ancient world. She writes to the king of that foreign empire, a rival, an enemy, and she says that her husband is dead and that she has no son, and that people are saying she should marry one of her servants, and that she is afraid, and she asks him to send her one of his own sons so that she can marry him and make him king of Egypt. The foreign king could not believe it. He thought it was a trick. He wrote back essentially, asking whether this could possibly be real, and he sent an envoy south to find out. And she wrote again, and she was furious, and she said in effect, "Why would I lie to you? Why would I write such a thing if it were not true? My husband is dead. I have no son. I will not marry a servant of mine. Send me your son." And he sent one. He put a prince on the road to Egypt to marry the widow of Tutankhamun and take the throne of the greatest kingdom on earth. Think about the months that girl spent waiting. She had written a letter to an enemy king, betraying her own court, and if it had been discovered, she would have been finished. And then she had to wait, while the envoy went north and came back, and while the foreign king made up his mind, and while a message went north again, and finally while a prince came slowly down through the mountains and the deserts with his escort, week after week, closer and closer. She must have counted the days. She must have known roughly when he would arrive. She must have sat in that palace, surrounded by men who wanted her, playing for time, inventing reasons to delay, holding them all off with nothing but nerve, waiting for a foreign boy she had never met to walk through the door and save her. And the prince never arrived. He was killed on the way. We do not know by whom, and we do not have to be terribly clever to guess. There were 2 men in Egypt for whom a foreign prince on the throne was the end of everything, and one of them commanded the army, and one of them married the widow instead. The old courtier took the throne, and he took her with it. There is a ring, a single ring with both their names on it, and that is the only trace we have of what must have been the loneliest marriage in the history of the world. And then she vanishes. She simply stops appearing. Nobody knows what happened to her, or where she is buried, or how she died, and the last we ever hear of the girl on the golden throne is her name pressed next to the name of an old man who was probably her grandfather's age. She was the last of them, and she went out in silence, and the foreign empire whose prince had been murdered on the road went to war over it, and they came south, and they took Egyptian territory, and they took Egyptian prisoners, and those prisoners, it seems, brought a plague home with them. And that plague swept through the foreign empire and killed enormous numbers of people, and it killed the king who had sent his son, and it killed his heir after him. A 20-year-old girl wrote a letter because she was frightened, and an empire fell apart because of it. And after the old courtier died, the soldier took the crown at last, and he ruled for a long time, and he was thorough. He set about erasing the whole thing. He took the boy's monuments and put his own name on them. He struck the boy out of the record. He struck the old courtier out of the record. He went after the heretic king with hammers, and he pulled down the temples of the sun disk stone by stone, and used the blocks as rubble, filling inside his own buildings, face inward, where nobody would ever see them. And that, by the way, is why we have them. Thousands of those blocks with the heretics' carvings on them sealed inside the walls of later temples, preserved perfectly in the dark for 3,000 years by the very men who were trying to destroy them. You cannot erase people, you can only bury them. And burial in Egypt is not the same as destruction. Egypt keeps things, and the official record, when it was finally written up, simply ran the years of the boy's reign into the account of the men who came after, as though he had never sat on the throne at all. He was gone, out of the lists, out of the temples, out of memory. And think about what that actually took. Somewhere a scribe sat down with the register of the kings of Egypt, a list that had been kept and copied and added to for something like 2,000 years, an unbroken chain of names running back to the beginning of the world, and he came to the place where a boy's name should have gone, and he left it out. He wrote the name before, and then he wrote the name after, and in between he wrote nothing and closed the book. That is how a person is deleted, not with fire, not with armies, with a clerk at a desk, quietly choosing not to write something down. And it worked. It worked completely, for longer than the whole of recorded history since. Every scholar who ever studied that country, every traveler, every priest, every historian of Greece and Rome who wrote about Egypt, every one of them, for 130 generations did not know his name, because a man at a desk decided not to write it. And out in the valley, under a hill, behind a plain doorway sealed with clay and stamped with the mark of the necropolis, a 19-year-old boy lay in a small hot room, in 3 coffins with a golden face that had probably been made for somebody else, with 130 walking sticks and 6 chariots, and a lock of his grandmother's hair in a small wooden box, holding his 2 daughters. And 100 years later, workmen cutting a much larger tomb up the hill dumped their rubble over his doorway. And that was that. The valley went on. Kings came and were buried and were robbed. The priests came in the night and moved the great mummies from hiding place to hiding place. And none of them ever thought to look under the rubble of the workmen's huts, because there was nothing there. Because everybody knew there was nothing there, because the man buried there had never existed. Rome came. Rome fell. The temples closed. The last priest locked the last door. The writing went silent. The sand came in. And a boy slept under a pile of builders' rubbish, alone, in the dark, with his games and his sandals and his wine and his daughters for 3,227 years. And then a stubborn, difficult, unlikable man with a shovel who has been searching that valley for years and has found nothing, and who is about to be told that his money has run out and the dig is over, decides to try one last season. And that is where we are going next. The man who found him was not a nice man. It is worth saying that at the start, because the story usually turns him into a hero, and he was not one. He was difficult and rude and stubborn to the point of self-destruction, and he had almost no friends, and by the time he made the greatest discovery in the history of archaeology, he had already thrown away his career once and was living, more or less, on other people's patience. He was born poor in England, the youngest of 11 children, and he was sickly, and he did not go to school in any real way. His father painted animals for a living, portraits of people's dogs and horses, and the boy learned to draw from him, and he could draw beautifully, and that was the only qualification he ever had. At 17, he was sent out to Egypt, because somebody needed a draftsman who would work cheap, and he could copy a wall painting faithfully, and that was that. He had no degree, he had no training, he had no money and no name and no connections. What he had was an unbelievable capacity for detail and a temper. The temper ended him the first time. He had worked his way up over years to become an inspector of antiquities, a proper official post, and he was good at it. And then one day a group of drunk tourists tried to force their way into a site, and there was a scuffle with the Egyptian guards, and the tourists complained, and Carter was told to apologize. And he would not. He would not apologize because he did not think he had done anything wrong, and because he thought his guards had been right, and he refused, and he went on refusing, and they pressed him, and he still refused, and in the end he resigned, and then he had nothing. For several years he lived in Egypt with no job, selling watercolors to tourists. That is what the greatest archaeologist of the century was doing in his 30s, painting little scenes of the Nile and hawking them to visitors for a few pounds so he could eat. And then he met a bored rich man. The rich man was an English aristocrat with an enormous house and a great deal of money and a serious problem, which was that he had nearly died in a motorcar crash and his lungs had never recovered. He could not spend the winter in England because the cold and the damp would kill him. So every year he went to Egypt where the air was warm and dry and where he was extremely bored. And a bored rich man in Egypt in those days took up digging. It was a hobby, like collecting stamps, except the stamps were 3,000 years old. He was not very good at it, and he knew it. And so he asked around for somebody who was, and the answer that came back was that there was a difficult man in Luxor selling paintings. And he knew more about that valley than anybody alive, and so the two of them went into business, and it was the most improbable partnership imaginable. An English lord and a man who had grown up with nothing, and it lasted for 16 years, and for most of that time they found almost nothing worth having. Now, the problem with the valley was that everybody knew it was finished. That was the settled opinion. The Valley of the Kings had been picked over for 100 years and more. 60-odd tombs had been found. Every one of them had been robbed in antiquity. There was nothing left. The great American who had held the digging rights before them had said so himself in print in his own book, that the valley was now exhausted. And Carter did not believe it, because of the arithmetic. He had gone through the king lists, and he had gone through the tombs, and he knew the names, and there was one name that came up, faintly here and there, in the debris of that valley. A name on a broken cup, a name on a scrap of gold foil, a name on some jars of embalming material that had been found in a pit. Somebody had been buried in that valley whose tomb had never been found. And so he did the only thing a man like him could do. He decided to move the entire valley floor. He drew a triangle on a map, an area he had not yet searched, and he set out to dig it down to bedrock. Systematically, every square yard, down through the rubble and the ancient flood debris and the chips of 100 generations of tomb cutters, all the way to the rock, and to sift everything. It took years. It was staggeringly boring. Season after season, hundreds of men with baskets, moving mountains of stone chips from one place to another, and finding essentially nothing. 5 seasons. 6. Nothing. Try to feel what those years were like. Every autumn, he comes back to that valley. Every autumn, he lays out the next section of the grid. Every day for months, hundreds of men carry baskets of stone chips from one place to another under a sun that does not let up. Every evening, he writes up what they found, and what they found was pottery fragments and flint and the rubbish of ancient workmen, and nothing. And every spring, he closes the dig and goes home and knows he is a year older, and a year poorer, and a year closer to the end. He was in his 40s. He had thrown away a career on principle. He had spent his best years digging holes in a valley that everyone had already told him was empty, funded by a man whose patience was a finite resource. His whole life had come down to a conviction that a boy nobody had heard of was buried somewhere under his feet. And the money was running out, and the war had cost his patron a great deal, and the estate was expensive, and the digging was expensive, and there was nothing to show for any of it. And in the summer of 1922, the rich man called him in and told him it was over. And Carter, who had never been able to back down from anything in his life, sat there in a great house in England and asked for one more season. One. He would pay for it himself, out of his own pocket if he had to, and if he found nothing, that was the end, and he would never mention it again. And the Lord, out of affection or out of exhaustion or because he simply could not stand to be the man who said no, agreed to fund one final year. And there was only one place left, one patch of ground that Carter had never dug, right in the middle of everything, right under everyone's feet. And the reason he had never dug it was that there was a group of ancient workmen's huts sitting on top of it, and clearing them meant destroying them, and they were themselves a piece of history. He had left it for last, because it was the least promising thing on the map. And on the 4th of November 1922, 3 days after his men started clearing the huts, a boy came running. They had found a step, cut into the rock. Under the floor of a hut, under the rubble, under 3,000 years. There is a story that the boy who found it was a water carrier, a young lad who had brought water out to the workmen and who was digging a little hole in the sand to stand his heavy jar upright in and whose fingers touched cut stone. I would love that to be true. It may not be. Carter never mentions it in his own account, and the story appears later, and it has the shape of something people wanted to be true. But somebody found it, and within a day they had cleared 12 steps, and at the bottom of them was a door. A plastered door, sealed and stamped all over with the seals of the ancient necropolis, and among them the seal of the jackal god above 9 bound captives, which is the mark that says, "This is a royal burial, and it is not to be opened." And it was intact. The upper part of it, at least, was untouched. And Carter, standing at the bottom of that stair with the greatest thing in the world behind 6 inches of plaster, did something almost superhuman. He filled it back in. He had the whole thing covered over with rubble and set guards on it, and went and sent a telegram to England saying in his careful telegraphic way that he had at last made a wonderful discovery in the valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, and that he had covered it over again until the Lord arrived. Congratulations. And then he waited 3 weeks, while his patron packed his bags in England and got on a boat and crossed the Mediterranean and came up the river. 3 weeks of Carter, sitting in that valley with the thing he had spent his entire life looking for, buried under a few feet of stone, 10 yards from where he was standing, and not touching it. I do not know how he did that. I do not think I could have, but he had promised and the man had paid and it was his to open, and Carter waited. 22 days. He filled his time with anything he could find. He bought a canary of all things and kept it in a cage in his house. And the workmen took it as a sign of good fortune, and they started calling the dig the Tomb of the Golden Bird. And he sat there, night after night, on his veranda, looking out at a hillside with the greatest discovery in human history sleeping under it, and he waited for a boat. On the 26th of November 1922, they went down the stairs together. They cleared the passage behind the first door and found it packed solid with rubble, and they dug it out, and at the far end there was a second sealed door. And they saw, both on the first door and on this one, something that must have made Carter's heart drop into his stomach. The seals had been broken, in the corner, and resealed. The tomb had been robbed, in antiquity, perhaps twice. Robbers had got in, not long after the burial, and had been through it, and had been caught or interrupted or frightened off. And afterward the officials of the necropolis had come and put things roughly back, and closed the hole, and stamped it shut again. Which meant it was not intact after all, which meant that after 30 years and a fortune and a lifetime, he might be about to open a door onto a stripped and empty room, exactly like every other tomb in that valley. He made a small hole in the top left corner of the door with an iron rod. He tested the air with a candle to see if it would burn, because there might be foul gas in there, and the flame flickered as the hot air came out of the hole and steadied, and then he widened the hole and put the candle in and put his eye to it. And he could not see anything at first, because the hot air made the flame gutter, and there was dust hanging in the dark. And then the flame steadied, and the details of the room began to come out of the darkness in front of him, and he stood there and did not say anything at all. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. And behind him, in the dark of the passage, the Lord could not stand it any longer, and asked whether he could see anything. And Carter, who was not a poet, and who had never in his life said a beautiful thing on purpose, said the only words anybody remembers. Yes, wonderful things. Now what was in there? The room they were looking into was the first of 4, and it was not the burial chamber. It was the antechamber, and it was, to put it bluntly, a junk room. A magnificent, staggering, priceless junk room, because everything had been thrown in, chariots dismantled, the wheels off, and the bodies stacked, because they would not fit through the door in one piece. Beds, chairs, chests, boxes piled on boxes, vases, statues, a great golden couch in the shape of a strange horned beast, with its feet on the floor and its head reaching almost to the ceiling, baskets of food, jars of wine, bundles of arrows, walking sticks, piles of linen tumbled out onto the floor, and the robbers had been through it, and they had made it worse. They had opened the chests and tipped them out and poured through them for the small valuable things, the gold, the oils, the metal, and thrown the rest aside. There was a box in there that had been packed with the most delicate objects, and it had been emptied and refilled at random by the officials who came after, who simply picked things off the floor and shoved them back in. But here is the thing, and it is why the tomb matters. The robbers took what was portable: small gold, precious oils which were worth a fortune, jewelry, metal fittings, and then they were caught, or panicked, and they ran. And what they left behind was everything else. Because it was too heavy or too awkward, or because they never got that far. The furniture stayed, the chariots stayed, the statues stayed, the clothes and the games and the wine and the sandals stayed, and the burial chamber stayed sealed. Every other royal tomb in that valley had been emptied down to the walls, systematically over years, by people who had all the time in the world. This one had been hit fast by frightened men who grabbed what was light and got out. That is the only reason we have it. And at the far end of the antechamber, between two doors, standing guard, facing each other, there were two life-sized figures of the king, black with gold, wearing kilts and headdresses and holding staffs with gold sandals on their feet, standing exactly where the priests had set them down, on either side of a sealed and plastered doorway. They had been standing there facing each other in the pitch dark for 3,227 years, guarding a door that nobody came to. And between them, behind the plaster, was the king. Rest there for a moment. Stand where Carter stood. You are at the bottom of 16 steps, in a passage cut into rock, in the middle of a valley in the desert, and it is night, and it is cold the way deserts are cold at night, and above you the stars are out over the mountain, and in front of you is a room that has been sealed in perfect darkness since before the founding of Rome. The air coming out of it is warm, and it smells of old wood and resin and dust, and it is air that was breathed by people who have been dead for 3,000 years, and that has been sitting in there still, in the dark, holding its breath, ever since. There is gold in front of you. There are animals with strange heads staring at you out of the shadows. There are chariots stacked against a wall by men who buried a king in a hurry and went home and had their dinner. And nothing has moved. Nothing has been touched. There is a footprint on the floor from a sandal, left by one of the last people to walk out of that room before the door was sealed. You could put your foot next to it. Let your shoulders come down. There is nothing to do here but look. The tomb is not going anywhere. It has waited 3,200 years for somebody to hold up a candle, and it can wait a little longer. The clearing of that tomb took 10 years. 10 years. That is the part nobody remembers. The discovery was one afternoon. The work was a decade. There were 5,398 objects in there, and Carter, for all his faults, did something in those 10 years that changed his profession forever. He did it properly. He could have emptied it in a season. Everybody wanted him to. The Lord's family wanted the objects. The press wanted a spectacle. The world was in a frenzy, and he refused. And he went slowly, and he brought in chemists and photographers and conservators and specialists of every kind. And he numbered every single object, and he photographed every single object in place before it was moved. And he drew grids and made maps and recorded exactly where everything had lain in relation to everything else. Some objects were so fragile they had to be treated with wax before they could be lifted, or they would have turned to powder in his hands. Some of the textiles came apart if you looked at them. There were sandals that dissolved. He worked, sometimes for weeks, on a single item. The man who had no education and no training and no diploma set a standard of care that professional archaeology is still trying to live up to. But he did not do it alone. And this is the part of the story that got erased, and I find that bitterly appropriate, in a tale that is entirely about erasure. There were hundreds of Egyptians on that dig. They dug the trenches, they carried the baskets, they cleared the huts, they found the step. One of them, whoever he was the first human being in 3,000 years to touch that stone, and we do not know his name, and we never will. And there was a foreman, and 4 of them, in fact, senior men who had worked those valleys for decades, who knew the ground the way a farmer knows his field, and who ran the workforce and made the decisions on the ground while the Englishmen were up at the house. Carter relied on them completely. They were the most experienced excavators in Egypt, and one family of them had been finding tombs for generations. Look at the photographs from that dig. Look at the famous ones, the men lifting the coffin, the men carrying the objects up the steps in the sun. Almost every pair of hands in those pictures is Egyptian, and in the captions, they are workmen, unnamed. The Englishmen are named, the Lord is named, his daughter is named, the photographer is named, the chemist is named. The men who actually found the tomb and who actually carried the greatest treasure in the world up out of the ground on their own shoulders are a crowd. It has taken 100 years for people to start going back through those photographs and trying to put names to those faces, and in some cases they have managed it, and in most cases they have not, and never will. They wanted their names spoken too, and they got exactly what the boy in the coffin got from the men who buried him. Now, the press. Because the discovery landed in the middle of a political earthquake, and Carter, who had the diplomatic instincts of a brick, made everything worse. Egypt in 1922 was not the Egypt of the century before. The country was in the middle of a national awakening. There had been an uprising a few years earlier. The British protectorate had just formally ended. There was a new government and a fierce and growing feeling that Egypt's past belonged to Egyptians, and that the era of foreigners carting away whatever they liked was over. And into that, in that exact year, comes the greatest treasure ever found on Egyptian soil, in the hands of an Englishman funded by an English lord. And what did the lord do? He sold the story. He signed an exclusive deal with a single London newspaper, giving them sole rights to report from the tomb, which meant that every other newspaper on earth, including every Egyptian newspaper, had to buy the news of their own country's greatest discovery from a paper in London. Egyptian journalists were kept out of the tomb. Egyptian reporters had to read about Egypt in an English paper and translate it back. You could not have designed a better way to enrage a nation that had just fought for its independence, and it got worse. There were rows over who could visit. There were rows over the objects. Carter fought the Egyptian authorities bitterly, and at one point he was so incensed that he downed tools and walked off the site in protest, and the Egyptian government, quite reasonably, locked him out. For nearly a year, the man who had found the tomb could not get into it because he had picked a fight with a country that had finally had enough of being told what to do with its own dead. In the end, it was settled, and he came back, and the work went on. But the outcome mattered enormously, because in the old days the fines would have been split, half for Egypt, half for the excavator, and the excavator's half would have gone off to London and New York, and the tomb of Tutankhamun would have been scattered across the museums of the world like everything else. And that did not happen. Egypt kept it, all of it. Every one of the 5,398 objects stayed in the country they were made in. It is the only royal tomb whose contents were never divided, never sold, never carried off. It is complete, and it is at home, and it is that way because a newly independent nation stood up at exactly the right moment and said no. And in the middle of it, they opened the burial chamber, and it was a wall of gold. The chamber was almost entirely filled by an enormous gilded shrine, a great box of wood covered in sheet gold, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with a gap of barely 2 feet around it. You had to edge around it sideways, and inside that shrine was another shrine, and inside that another, and inside that another. 4 of them nested, one inside the other, each one covered in gold, each one covered in the words that would carry him through the night. And inside the innermost shrine, a stone sarcophagus carved from a single block of quartzite, with 4 goddesses carved at the corners, with their arms spread out around it, holding it. and the lid of it was cracked across the middle, and the crack had been plastered and painted over in a hurry 3,000 years ago. And inside the stone box, a coffin, gilded wood, in the shape of the king, with his arms crossed on his chest. And inside that a second coffin, finer than the first, and inside that a third, and the third one was made of solid gold, not gilded, not covered, solid, 220 pounds of it, beaten and worked into the shape of a young man with his arms crossed, holding the crook and the flail. They had put a boy inside a coffin made of 1/4 ton of gold, and then they had put that inside 2 more coffins, and those inside a stone box, and that inside 4 golden shrines. And then they had sealed the room, and then they had sealed the tomb, and then they had never come back. And when they lifted the lid of the innermost coffin, there was linen, gone brown and black with age and resin, and on the face of it there was the mask. You know the mask. Everyone knows the mask. It is one of a handful of objects on this earth that almost every living human being would recognize instantly. Gold and blue glass, the striped headdress, the false beard, the vulture and the cobra on the brow, the enormous, calm, dark eyes looking straight ahead into nothing at all. It is beautiful. It is breathtakingly beautiful, and no photograph does it justice, and people stand in front of it and go quiet. And in 2014, somebody broke it. Museum staff were working on the lighting in the case, and the mask was moved, and the long braided beard on the chin came off. It had been attached, and it detached, and there it was, in somebody's hands, in a museum, in the middle of the night. And instead of stopping and calling the conservators and doing it properly, someone panicked. They glued it back on, with epoxy, hard setting, industrial epoxy, the wrong glue entirely, and they did it in a hurry, and it went on crooked and it dripped down the chin, and then somebody tried to scrape the dried glue off the gold with a metal tool and left scratches. There was a scandal. There was a trial. Museum staff were prosecuted. And then a team of specialists spent months undoing it, softening the epoxy with heat, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, scraping it away with wooden tools, and putting the beard back on the way it should have gone on in the first place, with beeswax, which is what the ancient craftsmen used. 3,300 years, it survived robbers and fire inside its own coffin and the collapse of a civilization, and being buried under rubbish and being cut out of the resin with knives. And it was nearly finished off by a light bulb and a tube of glue. It is fine now. You can go and look at it. If you get very close and you know where to look, you can still see faintly the line where it happened, and it is a portrait of a teenager with a limp who ruled a broken country and died of an infected leg and was hated by the men who buried him. Now, the body, and I have to tell you the truth about this, and the truth is not pleasant, they made a mess of it because the embalmers had poured so much resin over the body, bucket after bucket of the stuff, that when it hardened it had glued the king to the bottom of his own coffin, solid, like cement. The mask was stuck to his head, the body was stuck to the gold, and they could not get him out. They tried heat. They put the whole coffin out in the Egyptian sun in the open air at over 100 degrees for hours, hoping the resin would soften. It did not. And so, in the end, they took him apart. They cut the body up. They removed the limbs. They took the head off. They chiseled and scraped the gold off the flesh, and they cut through him to get the jewelry out of the wrappings, because there were 143 objects hidden in those bandages, amulets and collars and daggers and rings, and they wanted all of them. And then they put him back together roughly on a tray of sand and laid him back in the outermost coffin. The one thing the whole religion demanded. The one thing that 70 days of care and salt and linen and resin and gold had been for. The preservation of the body, whole and unbroken, so that the soul could come home at dusk and recognize it. They got him through 3,000 years, and the robbers and the rubble and the flood water and the burning inside his own coffin. And then a group of Englishmen took him apart with knives in the sunshine. I do not say that to be cruel to them. It was 1925, and they did not know what we know, and they were trying to save what they could. But it happened, and he deserves for it to be said. Now the curse, because you cannot tell this story without it, and I am going to give it to you honestly. In April of 1923, about 5 months after the tomb was opened, The lord who had paid for everything died in a hotel in Cairo. He had cut a mosquito bite while shaving. It became infected. The infection turned into blood poisoning and then into pneumonia, and his lungs, which had never been right since the car crash 20 years earlier, could not fight it, and he died. And the world lost its mind, because it was a wonderful story. The tomb had been opened. Warnings had been ignored, and the man who opened it was dead within months. And then the details started coming. At the moment he died, they said, the lights of the whole city of Cairo went out. And they did. Cairo's electricity supply was notoriously unreliable, and the lights went out all the time, but they went out that night. And back in England, at the exact same moment, his dog is said to have howled and dropped dead. And a famous novelist of the day, a man who had made his fortune writing about a detective who solved things through cold logic, went to the newspapers and said that it was probably an evil spirit that had done it, which shows you that even the most rational man alive can lose his footing when a story is good enough. The papers went wild, and ever since, every person even remotely connected with that tomb who has died has been added to the list. There are supposed to be about 20 of them, and the list, once you look at it, falls apart in your hands. There is a man who was shot dead by his own wife in a London hotel, which is a tragedy, but it is not a curse. There is a man who died of malaria some years later, in a country where malaria was everywhere. There is a relative of the Lord's who died of something entirely unrelated, and who had never been anywhere near the tomb. There is a financier who visited the site once as a tourist for an afternoon, and who died of pneumonia the following winter, at an age when a great many people died of pneumonia. There is a man who was murdered by his wife's family in a dispute that had nothing whatever to do with Egypt. And the list keeps growing because it can. Anybody who ever set foot in that valley is eligible, and everybody eventually dies. And so the list can be extended forever, and it has been for 100 years. That is how these things work. You gather the deaths that fit, and you quietly ignore the hundreds of people who went into that tomb, handled those objects, breathed that air, and then lived long, dull, healthy lives and died at 80 of nothing in particular. Now, here is the thing. Somebody did the arithmetic. A proper study, published in a medical journal, looked at the people who had actually been present at the opening of the tomb and the sarcophagus, and compared how long they lived against people of the same age and background who were not there. There was no difference. None. The people who were in that tomb lived on average exactly as long as anybody else, and the man who was in there more than anyone, the man who spent 10 years of his life inside it, who touched every one of those 5,000 objects, who lifted the mask off the boy's face with his own hands, who cut the body apart, who was in that chamber day after day for a decade. Howard Carter lived another 16 years and died of natural causes in his 60s in his bed in London. If there was a curse, it missed the one man it could not possibly have missed. But here is what did happen. And it is stranger than a curse. He never got over it. He had found the greatest thing anyone will ever find at the age of 48, and after the tomb was cleared, there was nothing left. He never made another discovery. He never dug another season of any importance. He was famous, and he was celebrated, and he lectured, and he was miserable. He fell out with everybody. He fought the Egyptian government so bitterly that they threw him off the site for a while and locked him out of his own tomb. He fought the press. He fought his colleagues. The academic establishment never quite accepted him because he had no degree, and he knew it, and it ate at him. He was never given an honor by his own country. Not a knighthood, not a medal, nothing. The greatest archaeological discovery in history, made by an Englishman, and England gave him nothing at all. He died in 1939, and his funeral was attended by 9 people. 9. The man who found Tutankhamun was buried in front of 9 mourners, 16 years after the entire world had known his name. On his gravestone, they carved a line from one of the objects in the tomb. It says roughly that he wishes for the spirit to live, and for the years to be many, and for eyes to see beauty, and the boy. But first, what the world did with him, because it is the reason you know his face and not the face of any other pharaoh. The world went mad. It hit in 1923, and it never really stopped. They called it Tutmania, and it swept through the West like a fever. Fashion changed. Overnight, everything was Egyptian, dresses with scarab clasps, headbands shaped like a crown, cosmetics sold on the promise of the eyes of ancient queens, jewelry covered in lotus flowers and cobras and hieroglyphs, most of them meaningless, some of them accidentally rude. Architecture changed. They built cinemas that looked like temples, with columns and a winged sun disk over the door, and you can still find them, standing on ordinary streets in ordinary towns with a queue outside for the evening showing. Songs were written about him. Dances were invented. There was a cocktail named after him. There were biscuits. There were shoes. And it was not only fashion, it was the first time in history that a discovery was covered like a serial. The newspapers ran it day by day, and the public waited for the next installment the way they waited for the next chapter of a novel. There were crowds in the valley. There were traffic jams of donkeys and motor cars on the road. People stood in the heat for hours for the chance to watch a box being carried up a flight of steps. It was the first global media event of the modern age, and its subject was a 19-year-old who had been dead for 3,000 years. And then, 50 years later, they did it again. In the 1970s, a selection of the treasures went on tour around the world, and it was, at the time, the most successful museum exhibition ever staged anywhere. Millions of people queued. In some cities, they queued around the block and through the night in the cold. They came in families. They came on buses from other states. Museums used to a few thousand visitors a month were taking tens of thousands in a week, and they had to hire new staff and build new wings and rethink entirely what a museum was for. The word blockbuster in the museum world comes from that tour, and what all those millions of people were queuing for in the end was the chance to stand in front of a piece of gold shaped like the face of a boy and look at him for about 30 seconds in silence before being moved along. That is what he became. He became the thing people stand in line to see. The boy, in the end, got everything he asked for. Think about what these people actually wanted. Go back to the beginning of all of it, not the gold. The gold was a means. They wanted three things: that the body be preserved, that the face be seen and known, and above all, that the name be spoken aloud in the world of the living. Because a name spoken is a life continued, and to be forgotten is the only true death there is. They tried to erase him. A scribe left his name out of a list. Men with chisels cut it off the walls. His monuments were taken and re-carved. He was buried in a cupboard under other men's rubbish, and forgotten so completely that for 3,000 years nobody on this earth knew he had ever lived. And now, his body is preserved in a climate-controlled case, more carefully guarded than any priest ever guarded him. His face, that golden face, is one of the most reproduced images in the entire history of human beings. It has been seen by more people than have seen almost any object ever made. And his name is spoken every single day in every country on earth, in languages that did not exist when he was breathing. Children learn it in school. It is said in museums, in classrooms, in living rooms, in 100 documentaries, in songs, in jokes, on posters on the walls of children who will never see the Nile. It has been said in this room tonight, by me, and heard by you. He is the most spoken name in the history of Egypt. They took his name off the wall, and it became the only one anybody remembers, and he is still there. That is the last thing, and I love it. Every other king of that valley has been taken away. They were lifted out and moved to museums, laid in cases in the capital, hundreds of miles from the mountains they chose. He is still in his tomb. He was left there, or put back there, and today, if you go down those 16 steps and along that passage and into that small painted room, he is lying in the outermost of his 3 coffins in the stone box, under the cracked and plastered lid, in the dark where they put him. The only king still sleeping in the Valley of the Kings, the one they tried hardest to forget, is the only one who never left. So let him rest. Let the valley be quiet and hot and still under the pyramid-shaped mountain that stands over it. Let the tourists go home at the end of the day, and the lights go off, and the doors close, and the dust settle in the passage. Let the 2 black guardians stand facing one another in the dark, holding their staffs as they have stood for 3,000 years, watching a doorway that no longer needs watching. Let the walking sticks lean in their corner, and the chariots wait, And the wine sit in its jars with the vintage written on the side, and the little wooden servants stand in their rows with nothing left to do. Let the two small coffins lie side by side, and the girls inside them sleep. Let the boy sleep. He was 19, he never asked for any of it. He carried a broken country on a broken body for 10 years, and he did it as well as anyone could have, and they hated him for it. And then they buried him in a borrowed tomb with wet paint on the walls and closed the door. And every one of the men who erased him is forgotten, and every one of the priests who cut his name from the stone is dust, and their names are gone, and his is not. There is nothing left to be afraid of. There is nothing left undone. The night is long, and the boat is moving, and the light is small, but it does not go out, and the morning always comes. Close your eyes now, breathe out, and sleep the way he is sleeping. Quiet, in the dark, in the valley, under the stars. With his name being spoken somewhere in the world at this very moment and at every moment forever.